Welcome to the P.A.S. Report podcast. If you're tired of censorship, outraged by government abuses, and thirsty for real insights, then you're in the right place. Get ready, because here, the fight for freedom never ends. Here's your host, Professor Nick Giordano.
What's up, everyone, and welcome to the P.A.S. Report podcast. This is your host, Nick Giordano. I'm glad you've joined me today. Make sure you follow and subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. Also, visit the P.A.S. Report website, pasreport.com, and make sure you sign up for the newsletter. Also, share this episode with your family and friends. It's the way we grow at the P.A.S. Report. I got a fantastic audience, and most of it is by people sharing this podcast. So continue to share it. I mean, you have President Trump moving with lightning speed. He wants to reshape and downsize the federal government, the federal bureaucracy. Now, one of the key areas that he's looking at is the Department of Education. That's what I want to talk about. Because during the campaign, he made his desire to eliminate the Department of Education clear. So don't forget that for well over a decade, Republicans have routinely called for the Department of Education to be dismantled, and they never followed through on it. Now, there are reports that President Trump plans to issue an executive order as early as this week regarding education in the United States. And President Trump has announced that he will unleash Musk and Doge on the education department. And it seems like that's happening because he already found $1 billion of waste, which is not surprising. But as of this recording, the executive order has not been issued. Now, to be clear, President Trump cannot dismantle the Department of Education through an executive order. He could pare down some of its operations, but he can't eliminate it. Only Congress has the power and authority to eliminate the Department of Education as a cabinet-level position. It's their job. They are the ones that can completely eliminate it. They could drop it back down to the Office of Education, which that's what it was known as prior to it being elevated to a cabinet-level position, or they could eliminate it completely. And I'll get into the differences later of what's the difference between an office and a department. But like most things, the president does suggest it has Democrats, the legacy media, the teachers' unions, the consultant class. It has them apoplectic, right? I want you to take a listen to Congresswoman Mad Maxine Waters as she tries to storm the Department of Education headquarters. Take a listen to what she does. Now,
look them in the eye. Come on, hold your face up. Look at him. Let him see you. This is him. Look at it. What's your name? Tell us your name. Give me that ID again.
Giving you the ID, I showed it to you.
So what?
I showed you the ID.
You do what?
I showed you the ID.
Could you let me see the ID again? Huh?
No.
No? Will someone else ask him for the ID? Will you ask him for it? He won't let me see it again. You didn't see it. You didn't see it. They didn't see it.
obviously, I'm being hyperbolic when I say she tried to storm the Department of Education, but I want people to notice something. Look at how she berated that poor guy who was just doing his job. And here is something to keep in mind. How you treat other people, particularly ordinary people, it reveals a lot about you. And I'm just saying, no matter my political beliefs, I treat people with dignity and respect. Even if I disagree with them on the political issues, I don't really care. I'm going to treat them with respect. And I may call our politicians morons, because many of them are. I may call now Senator Schiff an imbecile. How he became a senator is beyond me. But when it comes to ordinary people, I would never call them names. And Schiff and other politicians, let's be honest, they've earned the labels I've given them. But even if I were to see these people in person, I would still be respectful, because that's how I was raised. So it speaks volumes that Maxine Waters talks to an ordinary person like that. In any event, you have proponents of the Department of Education arguing that its closure is going to be disastrous. They argue that if we eliminate the Department of Education, we're going to create a generation of students that can't read or write. I have a newsflash for you. For all those people saying this, we don't have to wait for the next generation. We don't have to wait for the closure of Department of Education. Students already can't read or write. And I see this firsthand in my classroom every semester. Other college professors see it throughout the country. Millions of students graduate unable to read, do basic mathematics, or even understand how the government works. And that should be the real scandal. So you would think that's where the outrage would be directed. And I want to ask all of you out there, when was the last time you saw congressional people storm a Department of Education for the abysmal student proficiency numbers. You know, just last week, you had the National Assessment for Educational Progress release the nation's report card. It showed that students remain at historic lows when it comes to proficiency levels. Where was the outrage at? How come the Maxine Waters of the world aren't outraged about that? I don't see the Democrats or the media, the talking heads, the teachers union. I don't see them expressing outrage at that. Where's the outrage concerning the fact that about 50% of college freshmen are going to have to take at least one remedial course for content they should have learned in high school? Or what about companies having to spend $3.1 billion to provide remedial writing training to recent college graduates for stuff they should have mastered in college? Or the fact that 12th grade textbooks are written at the 7th through 9th grade levels because 12th graders can't read at a 12th grade level. So where's the outrage over that? Especially considering that we spend approximately $1.4 trillion of your money each and every year, if we take federal, state, and local spending on education, and yet we have schools that cannot produce a single student that's proficient in reading and mathematics. So why don't we see people like Congresswoman Waters complain about that? And listen, Congressman Waters should be welcomed into the Department of Education. Any lawmaker should be allowed to go into these cabinet departments. They're the ones that have oversight over these agencies. But part of the problem is that Congress doesn't use their power of oversight to rein in the bureaucracy and demand better. In fact, they want a bigger bureaucracy. They want it more bloated, more failures. And it's getting sickening. You know, I'm someone that believes that this is a photo op. Their outrage is fake, because the outrage should be towards an education system that has failed students year after year, that leaves them unprepared for the real world. And yet the very people responsible for this failure would rather cling to the status quo. It's completely ridiculous. It shouldn't be accepted. And that's what I want to focus on in this episode. I want to talk about why the Department of Education was created in the first place. More importantly, though, I want to dispel some myths about what will happen if it's eliminated and why this is just one small step towards reform. See, we need an education system that works for students, not bureaucrats. And eliminating the Department of Education is a step toward that goal. I briefly want to explain what the purpose of the Department of Education was when it was first elevated to cabinet level status in 1979 in the Carter administration. We need to look at the statute that created the Department of Education through Congress. And if we look, it's Title 20, U.S. Code 3401, 3402. Now, if you take 1 minute to read U.S. Code 3401, because that's all it takes, you would see its authority is limited, as it should be. You would also see how the department has long deviated from the original authority it had. Take subsection 3. Okay, the law and Congress recognize that, quote, parents have the primary responsibility for the education of their children, and states, localities, and private institutions have the primary responsibility for supporting that parental role. Now, today, you have Democrat lawmakers, union bosses, and a lot of media pundits out there that believe that parents have no role to play in their child's education. They think the government knows what's best for your child, not you, but the government. And the stats say otherwise, right? Because we're failing. And if you look at subsection 4, it states that the primary public responsibility for education is reserved respectively to the states and the local school systems and other instrumentalities of the states. Nowhere does it say that education is a federal responsibility or should be a federal responsibility. It's left up to the states the way it should be. We have a concept of federalism. Unfortunately, that concept has been eviscerated by an ever-growing federal blob in the creation of the Department of Education that tries to usurp state and local control. But I want to ask the audience, as federal authority and control has expanded, as the Department of Education has gotten more entrenched in the schools, has student performance increased or decreased? It's actually a very simple question, because that's what this is really about. That's what it comes down to. You take a look at Title 20, U.S. Code 3402, and it created the agency mission. The top mission of the Department of Education was to promote student achievement and educational excellence at all levels. Let's get real for a moment. It failed. If the Department of Education's mission was to promote student achievement and educational excellence by every single objective, measurable standard, The Department of Education has been an abject failure. We are and have been seeing entire generations of students graduate unprepared for college. They're unprepared for the workforce. They're unprepared for life. They lack common sense. They're void of basic life skills. So why do so many want to save a failing system? I don't get it. Why do so many refuse to change it? But more importantly, we have to look at who benefits from the status quo, right? Because that's what it comes down to. The answer to all those questions is simple. It's about power, money. It's about ideological control. And one of the biggest beneficiaries of this broken system is the teachers union. I'm not talking about all unions. There are some great unions out there. And in full disclosure, I'm an active member of a teachers union. However, we cannot ignore the two biggest education unions. We can't ignore the National Education Association, the NEA, and the American Federation of Teachers, the AFT, because they have amassed enormous political power within this country. And they wield it to protect their own interests, not the interests of the students, but their own interests, and to protect the union leadership. See, these unions, they rake in hundreds of millions of dollars in dues from teachers each year. But instead of focusing on classroom success, they're going to pour tens of millions of dollars into political activism to push a far-left agenda. And it exclusively supports Democrat candidates and left-wing causes. Just so you're aware, in 2022 alone, the NEA spent $66 million on political campaigns. And then I constantly hear about teachers having to shell out their own money to buy supplies. So I want to challenge all you teachers out there. All you teachers that spend money on your own supplies for your classroom, all you teachers that support the NEA and the AFT, are you okay with shelling out your own money for supplies, yet your union is pouring in tens of millions of dollars into political campaigns and left-wing causes? These are the same unions who fight against merit-based teacher pay, accountability measures, and policies that would remove bad teachers from the classroom. Because it's not about academic achievement. Again, I'm just being honest with you. It's about political clout. That's what it comes down to. That's what the unions are fighting for. If you're an ordinary teacher out there, how have your contracts been over the course of the last couple of years? Yeah, there are some big city unions that have gotten good contract raises. But for the most part, most teachers have gotten 1%, 1.5%, maybe 2% raises over the course of the last few years. So how's your union working out for you? All right? And we need to examine that. And it's not just about the unions. You have the bureaucracy itself. You have the Department of Education. Since the department's creation, it has ballooned into a massive federal agency. It has over 4,000 federal employees, a budget of about $80 billion per year in discretionary spending. So $80 billion a year in discretionary spending, about $175 billion per year in mandatory spending, that's student loans and Pell Grants and stuff like that. But overall, with the $80 billion number, the Department of Education has seen a 200+% increase in its budget since the 1990s. So remember, when everyone's talking that the schools have no money, that we need to invest more in education, it's not really a money issue. That's a lie. That's a myth that exists. We have increased spending across the board when it comes to education. Almost every year, with the exception of a handful, spending in education has actually gone up from the local district to the state level to the federal level. And the results are getting worse. It's not rocket science to figure out that investing more money into the system isn't going to fix the problem. Because, think about it for a minute. You increase the Department of Education's budget, and yet student proficiency continues to worsen. Obviously, it's not a money problem. And let's remember that not a single student is directly taught by the Department of Education. Not a single Department of Education employee actually teaches students. So what exactly do they do? Well, they push pens. They write regulations, they create mandates, they enforce compliance, but they obviously don't improve student outcomes, which was one of the main missions of the Department of Education. Okay, when we look at federal education funding, it's a slush fund. Let's be honest. It's a slush fund for pet projects, ideological initiatives. You have billions getting funneled to the consultant class for compliance enforcement, grants, DEI. The Government Accountability Office itself says that there are numerous duplicative and ineffective programs within the department, but we just keep pushing more money into the system as if that's fixing the problem. And look at the consultants, because you're getting a lot of people rich, and there's no better example than the DEI activists, the DEI industrial complex, the ideological capture of the education system by socialists. Consider how this toxic ideology has affected every level of education. Consider how many school districts out there went to these outside consultants, paid them tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars to bring them to their schools to build out a DEI program, to talk about DEI, to train teachers on DEI. It's a scam. It's all a scam. Okay? And the Department of Education has become a pipeline for progressive activism to push all this nonsense, to push the DEI, the critical race theory, the gender ideology, social justice. Instead of focusing on the core subject materials, reading, writing, arithmetic, and civics, we're bombarding students with political activism disguised as education. And just look at 2024. Department of Education funneled $1 billion in DEI initiatives, and reading and math scores continued to plummet. At what point do we say enough is enough? At what point do we say it's broken? You have federal bureaucrats push race-based curricula, social justice activism, climate curricula, gender ideology into every single lesson because of these funding initiatives. And the federal government, they're not public servants anymore. They're ideologues. Just consider the 2024 presidential race. 84% of donations from federal employees went to Vice President Kamala Harris. We're talking $4.2 million here. When 84% of bureaucrats are donating that much money to a presidential candidate, it kind of tells you something. See, I made a vow. I'm in the classroom. I don't donate to political causes or to political candidates because it's public information. And it is my belief, and this is just me personally, people could disagree with me out there, but it is my belief that I don't want my students to sit there and access the information, the public information, to see that I'm financially vested in any type of political candidate. They shouldn't see that I have a financial interest, a financial stake tied to a political candidate. So I don't make donations. I make it clear on the outside of my classroom where I stand on the issues. But I believe that if my students see I have a financial stake in a political candidate, well, how can they see me as someone that's being objective inside the classroom? And I think that's my main point. And listen, it's not like my students would actually go and do that level of research, but it's a code I live by. And I'm not saying that federal bureaucrats shouldn't be allowed to give money, but it speaks volumes that they do. And it speaks volumes that 84% of the donations goes one way. If student success was truly a priority, the people in charge of the education system for decades, why are they so opposed to real reform? Why do they get so mad? Why do they fight school choice? Why do they oppose transparency and accountability? Instead, they promote more spending, bigger budgets, but not better outcomes. And that is the honest truth. The education system doesn't serve students. It serves unions. It serves bureaucrats and ideologues. They're the ones benefiting from the status quo. It's why they engage in fearmongering about generations of students who will be unable to read and write if the Department of Education is dismantled. So now it's time to debunk the fearmongering and reveal the truth about eliminating the Department of Education. And remember, that's one small step. That's not going to fix the failed system. But the hysteria about the Department of Education's elimination is hysterical. You got these doomsday proclamations that it's going to somehow lead to the collapse of American education. Again, I want to provide a news flash for everyone. It's already collapsed. I spoke about it years ago. It was one of the very first episodes I did on this podcast. But I keep hearing the narrative that without the Department of Education, students are going to be abandoned. Schools are going to refuse to help children with disabilities. Civil rights protections are going to vanish overnight. Student loans will disappear. Standards are going to fall apart as if they're standards now. Learning will be destroyed. It's all nonsense. There's no doubt about that. It's all BS. And the people pushing these claims, the people that are pushing these lies, are the very ones who have been in charge of the education system. They're the very ones who have overseen this steady decline as they demand more money from the taxpayer. So let's break it down. You have the first myth. If you eliminate the Department of Education, that means there's going to be no more protections for students with disabilities. I mean, you've had to have heard this before. Without the DOE, then kids with disabilities are going to be left behind. That is fundamentally false. That is not true, because the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act idea was passed before the Department of Education was even created. Okay? And it remains federal law. It's not like it changes. The Department of Education does not protect these students. The law protects them. So even without the department, IDEA would still be enforced and it would still be in place, just as it was prior to 1979. The same goes for 405 plans, which fall under the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, another law that was passed before the Department of Education became cabinet level. Schools are legally required to accommodate students with disabilities. You don't need a massive bureaucracy in Washington to enforce that. So no, eliminating the Department of Education does not eliminate protections for students with disabilities. That is a scare tactic that they're using. The second myth, the Department of Education ensures civil rights protections and educational equity. Now, the left claims that if the Department of Education ceases to exist, discrimination's all of a sudden going to run rampant in schools, right? That all of a sudden it's going to be a bunch of racists that are controlling the school system. But here's the reality. The Department of Education has completely distorted civil rights laws to impose a radical agenda that goes well beyond what Congress ever authorized them to do. It redefined what quote-unquote sex means in Title IX to include this idea of gender identity. Now, Congress never approved that, but it forced schools to comply with this idea of gender identity or risk lose federal funding. It weaponized Title IX investigations, punished schools and students based on ideological mandates. But I think the worst thing it did, it destroyed due process on college campuses where students are guilty until they prove themselves innocent. And a simple accusation can destroy someone's life, and you don't even have to provide any evidence whatsoever to substantiate the claim. And I think that's a big part of the problem. So let's be honest, once again, if the Department of Education was truly ensuring equal opportunity, then why are Black and Hispanic students still suffering the worst outcomes despite decades of federal intervention, despite decades of left-wing control of the education system? And if actual civil rights violations occur, let's be honest, the Department of Justice is perfectly capable of handling those cases. We don't need a bloated, politicized Department of Education for that. Then you have the third myth, that the Department of Education provides essential funding that schools can't live without. Yeah, maybe they can't live without it because they've become addicted to it. See, the argument here is that public schools under Title I programs are going to disappear if the Department of Education ceases to exist. Again, this is false because federal funding doesn't just come from the Department of Education. I mean, Title I and special education funding can be block granted to the states. Let the states, they already control how these funds are used. So why not just cut out the middleman? Why do we need an entire bureaucracy for this? Pell Grants are still going to exist. Student aid will still exist. It could be managed through other federal programs. We don't need a massive bureaucracy overseeing them. And let's not forget, the more federal money schools take in, the more strings come attached. And that's where people will say, well, we need that money. Well, no, you become dependent on it. That's the problem. And it's dangerous because you rely on these federal funds to your own detriment. Instead of being accountable to the parents and communities, you have to answer to Washington, D.C. So we need to get rid of that dependency. Then you have the fourth myth, that the Department of Education holds schools accountable. I mean, come on, this is one of the most laughable arguments. How does the Department of Education hold schools accountable? How? I would love to know, because I spoke about the actual results in the first segment. Math and reading scores are at their lowest levels in decades, despite us spending $1.4 trillion a year on education. You have schools that cannot produce a single student proficient in math or reading. You have college students that can't pass a basic citizenship exam, can't tell the difference between the American Constitution and the Russian Constitution? How are schools being held accountable? Someone, please explain this to me. The fact is that students are held hostage because of their zip codes. The federal government doesn't hold anyone accountable. It doesn't hold these schools accountable. All we see is worse outcomes. What schools have been shut down because of the worse outcomes? The fact is the education department turns a blind eye to the failing schools. It pours billions of tax dollars and resources into leftist social experiments instead of basic academics. Billions of dollars in grants funneled to DEI programs rather than improving educational outcome. We spent billions of dollars pushing this idea of STEM initiatives. For over a decade, we wanted to get more American students pursuing STEM fields. And yet, what do we see? We see stagnation and decline. So in the words of Joe Biden, come on, man, give me a break. You know, you look at it, there is no accountability. The people in charge of the education system should have been fired long ago. Then you have the other myth, the fifth myth, that, you know, the federal government doesn't determine what's being taught in the classroom. Those decisions are made at the state and local level. The education department isn't influencing what your kids are learning in school. Are you kidding me? Again, this is a lie. The Department of Education uses grants to pressure states into adopting their policies and their curricula. It's partnered with activist organizations throughout the country to push all this nonsense that they're pushing, whether it's the climate change activism or the gender stuff. And, I mean, all you have to do is look at Common Core. Oh, it was a state decision. The states chose to take Common Core. No, the states were forced into it because states were threatened. You either accept Common Core or you lose federal funding if you don't adopt it. It's simple as that. See, with the way the federal government operates, it's an extortion racket. Okay, it's to bully and blackmail. If we did 1/10 of what the federal government does, we'd all be in prison. So they do have an influence over the curriculum. Now, do they fully control it? No. But they control the purse strings. And those that control the purse strings have the power. They become dependent on this money. And I want everyone to think about this. Again, we spend over $1 trillion per year, in some cases upwards of $35,000 per student per year. Student performance is declining. The education department, the education system is more centralized and bureaucratic than ever. And yet, literacy rates continue to plunge. The same politicians and unions that are screaming about the potential closure of the Department of Education, dismantling the Department of Education, they're praising the importance of it. Well, they're the ones that presided over these failures. So why should we trust the people who created this mess to fix it? Why? The fact is, these people forfeited their credibility a long time ago, and they should not be able to dictate education policy any longer. They failed. It's as simple as that. We don't need a bloated federal bureaucracy to ensure students get an education. What we need is real reform. Real reform that puts parents back in control. Real reform that restores local decision-making. Real reform that focuses on learning rather than ideology. Eliminating the Department of Education, it isn't about destroying the education system. It's about fixing it. And it's only one small step in that process. Now, let's talk about solutions, right? It's enough with the complaining. How do we create an education system that actually works for students and not the bureaucrats, the teachers' unions, and the politicians? And one of the first things that we need to realize that we have to do is we have to save and strengthen public education. Listen, I don't want to see the public school system destroyed. I want to see it fixed. The reality is that the overwhelming majority of students are going to go through the public education system. And that's why we need real reform that puts students first. You could give your child the best education in the world. You could send them to private school. You could homeschool them. But if the vast majority of students are going through a failed public education system, it's not going to matter what education you give your child when everything comes crumbling down. So we have to recognize that the public education system is going to remain. I'm under no illusion that it's going to go away anytime soon. There are some people that are pushing for that, okay? But I don't think that's a realistic goal, is to get rid of the public education system. Let's start by fixing it. That's actually more able to be accomplished than eliminating the public education system. But we also need to return control of education to parents and local districts, local communities, where they need to make their decisions. Education decisions should be made at the state and local level, not dictated by unelected bureaucrats in Washington, D.C. And we need to put pressure on the state bureaucrats that create curriculums and standards. We need to listen to the parents that know what's best for their children, not those that are pushing ideological agendas. And I think school choice is a key to breaking the monopoly that has trapped millions of kids in failing schools for far too long. Whether it's charter schools or private schools, homeschooling, or even another public school in neighboring districts, parents should have the power to decide where their child's education dollars go. And then we need to prioritize core academics again. Schools need to get back to the basics. They need to focus on reading, writing, math, science, and civics. Not activism, not DEI mandates, not political indoctrination. But we also need to teach students real life skills. And I'm talking about instilling manners in students from early ages, and instilling a sense of discipline in students in early ages. As students do get into the upper grades, they need to be forced to take things like shop class, right? A lot of schools have done away with shop class because it takes away from their indoctrination. But students should learn how to change a light bulb. Students should learn how to be able to change a light fixture, how to fix, a plumbing disaster, a clogged toilet, a clogged sink. They should learn how to cut a piece of wood. These are skills that you could take with you no matter what field you're going into. These are skills that will remain for the rest of your life. Teach students how to cook. Teach students how to sew a button on a piece of clothing. Teach students how to manage their personal finances. I mean, these are all things that will go a long way in cultivating a student body that grows up to be responsible individuals in our country who could sustain themselves and don't have to rely on the government or anyone else to take care of their every whim. So we need to get back to the core that the education system was founded on. We need to be able to produce students that actually read books. They open them up, that know to put down the phones, that understand how to use technology responsibly. It's crazy that we even have to talk about this, but again, common sense is something that doesn't really exist in our society anymore. Well, it's time to bring it back. It's time to develop well-rounded students who become productive members of society. It's critical. And we have to hold schools accountable. If a school consistently fails to teach students, the funding should be tied to performance. It's not rocket science. We need to reward success, not failure. We have a choice. We could either continue funding a bureaucracy that's in decline, or we could put students and our children first. That's our choice. The Department of Education has had over 40 years to prove its worth, and it has failed by every objective metric. It is absurd to think that we should continue to pour billions of taxpayer dollars into a failed system. It's time to put education back in the hands of parents and communities. It's time to put it in the hands of educators who actually care about their students and care about results. Maybe then we could begin to turn the tide. Maybe then we could begin to improve student performance. Now, please share this episode with family and friends. We need to get people to actually look at the education system and recognize that the more money that's been pumped into it, the worse things have gotten. We have to open people's eyes. So share this podcast with other people. Also, take 30 seconds to leave a 5-star rating and write a review on any podcast platform that allows it, including Apple and Spotify. And I want to thank you for joining me. I'll be back next week with another great episode of P.A.S. Report Podcast.
Thank you for listening to the P.A.S. Report. Don't forget to rate, share, and hit that subscribe button. That way you'll never miss an episode. For more exclusive content and updates, visit us at PASreport.com and follow Professor Giordano on all social media platforms at P.A.S. Report.